National Child Protection Week is marked annually in South Africa to raise awareness about the rights of children. While South African society is a society with a constitution, and it does have the highest regard in as far as the rights to equality and dignity for everyone, children unfortunately continue to be vulnerable, and they face crimes including rape and murder. Let's talk then about some of the challenges facing the country's children. The Save the Children CEO Steve Miller joins us tonight. Steve, good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. You know, one of the biggest concerns is that we live, as I was saying earlier, in a country that really ensures the protection of the rights of children. And yet, when we look even just over the last 2 years of what has happened under COVID-19, it is children that have suffered the most. They have really felt the brunt of all that has happened, and yet their voices are least represented.
Yes, no, you're entirely correct. This week, Child Protection Week, is about raising awareness of these rights, and they're very much enshrined in international commitments that we've made as a country, whether it's the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child or the African Charter on the Rights and the Welfare of the Child, our own Constitution, and our Children's Act. It all speaks to child rights not as a value, but as an obligation to move from thinking about children, and particularly vulnerable children, as in need of charity, to recognizing that they actually have rights, and we must deliver on these rights. We must protect, defend, and promote them.
When we look at what the biggest threats facing South Africa's children are, what would you say those are?
The threats are numerous, unfortunately, in our country. And it's not just South Africa. Let's be clear about that. We have a very violent history in this country of apartheid. We all grew up with violence. It's the masculine culture. So it's around us. But we're not unique in that. What we're seeing over the last couple of years with COVID, increased conflict, and the climate change issue is a slippage in all the gains that we've been making on child rights. So here in South Africa, if we're looking at protection in particular, if we're looking at violence against children, there's some issues that are now coming out stronger than others, such as teenage pregnancy, which we can speak about. We've seen an increase in child murder as well. But all forms of violence, we've seen an increase over the last couple of years. And I think all of us should really understand the urgency of this moment and act accordingly.
When we look at the responses, you know, it's often very easy to go to government and say, well, government should come up with all of the solutions that are facing society. But the reality is that where children are concerned, it very much involves those guardians and parents of the children as it does government.
Yeah, look, violence takes place in many areas. It can be in the home, in the community, in schools. Yes, the government takes overall responsibility as the duty bearer, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. But we do have the most incredible legislation, firstly, in the country, as well as plans. We've got a national plan of action for children, and it's spot on. So we don't lack for the frame. Where we lack is in the implementation. And that, as you point out, that's a multi-stakeholder affair, led by the government, but of course there's a role for civil society, religious groups, private sector, and you and me.
One of the things, of course, that we saw in the height of the pandemic was the issue around the school nutritional feeding scheme. And, you know, there was a big court case over whether or not something like that should be continued. And one of the things, Steve, would be to try and ensure that when South Africa finds itself in crisis, that a program like that we know, you know, serves so many different children in various communities, especially impoverished communities. Many of them are relying on the meals they receive at school as their only meals of the day. How do we ensure that something like that is entrenched in our policy, that even in the midst of crisis, we're not necessarily pausing some of these crucial programs?
Great question. One word: consistency. You know, so many of us, when we come to these child protection weeks or 16 days of activism. We do it year after year, and increasingly people are frustrated, and they're saying, what's happening? Why are we not seeing anything change? In fact, things are getting worse. What is going on? And it's all about consistency. Again, we know what to do. We have, when it comes to violence, we have all the tools that we need, all the know-how. We've done the research. We know what works. But what we need is consistency on that. So school feeding is a great example of having, this is an intervention that has humongous benefits for children. I mean, if you're hungry, you can't do anything. You certainly can't learn. This has to happen. We have to recognize that we live in the most unequal society in the world, and something like this has to be absolutely entrenched in what we do. And when we have a pandemic like we did now that took everybody by surprise, we need to continue through thick and thin. So consistency, I think, is what we're asking for consistently too, but certainly this week, that we stick to what we know what works, we invest in it, and we make things happen for children.
Save the Children CEO Steve Miller, let me thank you for your time on News at Prime this evening.